But so I'll ask you a few questions. How many of you actually have a relative or a close one who suffers from memory loss? Hands going up, probably the majority. And I'll say you're not alone. Memory loss is a very, very common problem. The number one risk factor for memory loss and various causes of memory loss, dementia being the most common, is getting older. So we're all at risk. I sometimes tell my patients, I'm not sure if they find this funny or not, but I often tell them that life is a terminal illness. It doesn't end well. Both my parents suffer from Alzheimer's disease as well. Lost my dad to COVID in an institution prior to his passing. And my mom recently from an independent living to assisted care. I feel like I need to do a song and dance now. Perhaps I'll ask a couple, I just maybe talk a little bit more while my computer.
Yeah, there's a few questions on that.
Maybe I can do that.
Yeah. What are the questions?
All right, I'll answer a few questions. Is Alzheimer's heritable or inheritable? And the answer to that is almost always yes. In fact, almost all diseases are in some form or another inheritable. But the question is how inheritable. So I think we think of somebody being tall or somebody being smart or somebody being anxious or as things that run in families. Off, yeah, I think.
We're almost there. Patience is the virtue. We love it.
So many things are heritable, but it's a little bit like playing poker. You're given a hand, those are your genes, and you can play them well, or you can play them not so well. So you can still control exactly where you're going to go. Blue eyes, on the other hand, are an inheritable trait that you will, if you have the gene for blue eyes, you're going to have blue eyes. So Alzheimer's disease is a bit of both. There are single genes that cause Alzheimer's disease. You get the gene, you get the disease. They're autosomal dominant, and you can tell when you're in a family, half the people in the family have the disease. They usually get it very young, in their 30s, 40s. So not the kind of Alzheimer's disease that you're used to seeing. But there are many other genes that increase the risk of having Alzheimer's disease. That's your poker hand. And if you have those, the more than you have, the more likely you are to get the disease, or the more likely you are to have the disease earlier. One big gene that you might have heard about is called ApoE. It's a gene that confers risk for Alzheimer's disease. And I'll have a few comments about that later. Okay, well, let's get started. Does anybody know who this is?
August Day Tour.
Yes! Yes, sorry. On my way to tell the names already. August Ditta was a German woman. She's probably 52 or 53 when this picture was taken. I'll say two slides about her, just because she's interesting. So she's actually born in Kassel, Germany, in 1850. She was born August Hochmann. She was schooled till age 14, so she got a bit of schooling. At the time in Germany, with her socioeconomic status, going to school till you're 14 is considered high education. So she was well educated. She became a seamstress. She was married to a railway clerk called Karl Ditta at age 23 and moved to Frankfurt, where she had what Karl called a happy and harmonious life. They had a daughter together as well. At age 50, though, she developed insomnia, couldn't sleep, memory loss, delusions. She believed things that were not really based in reality. Delusions of infidelity, that her husband was cheating on her. She was paranoid. and she became unable to sort of continue being the housewife or the homemaker. Carl was unable to take care of her, so he had to have her brought to an institution. The institution in Kassel was called the Institute for the Mentally Ill and Epileptic. She was brought there in November 1901 at the age of 51. There, she was under the care of a physician who was struck with her decline, how she lived a very, very normal life up until the age of 50 or so, and then declined fairly quickly. He would follow her in this institution until 2 years later when he had to move to Munich for his own career. But Carl, her husband, was having trouble paying for the facilities, and the physician in question arranged for her to stay for free. He was so struck with her disease that he wanted to know more. He arranged for her to stay for free if, when she passed, she donated her brain for science. So Auguste, she passed in 1906, a few years later, and her brain was brought to the physician in question. 6 months later, he published a paper about it. This physician, of course, is Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's had just developed a technique that allowed to see things under the microscope that we couldn't see at the time. A thing called silver staining, which allowed to bring out from the tissues abnormal proteins that were accumulating where they shouldn't. These are some of his drawings. These are tangles that were accumulating in the brain of Auguste Deter. This is the first time pathology, actually changes in the cortex of the brain, were associated with somebody who suffered from a decline in cognition and behavior. Before that, we had no idea that anything was going wrong with the brain other than something that psychoanalysis should be able to fix. This is certainly not the case here. So we owe a lot about what we know about Alzheimer's disease to Alzheimer, but also to Auguste. She probably had one of these genetic diseases, the ones that cause the disease to occur quite young. In fact, that's one of the things that people were thinking of analyzing her. So I'm going to talk about Alzheimer's disease and dementia, both of those things. I'm talking about risk factors, mechanisms that lead to the disease, and if we have time, new treatments. So this is the brain, the cortex of the brain. This is the substrate where diseases of the brain cause their havoc. Diseases of the brain are many, and often we hear a lot of different terms that describe these diseases. You've certainly heard Alzheimer's disease, you've heard dementia. There's others like vascular cognitive impairment, mild cognitive impairment, Lewy Body dementia, frontotemporal dementia. These are all different terms that refer sometimes to the same process, but sometimes to different processes that lead to neurodegeneration. One of the things that we're asked almost every time in clinic is, what's the difference between dementia and Alzheimer's disease? So dementia is a syndrome. It's something that you acquire with age. Most of us will. And a syndrome that progresses slowly and affects our ability to do things day to day. So until we have trouble doing things day to day, we don't use the word dementia. We use the word sort of cognitive impairment. But when we start having trouble doing things that we need to do to live independently, then we start using the term dementia. Another term we use instead of dementia these days is major neurocognitive disorder. I've just described a process, a syndrome, a state, not being able to complete your activities of daily living. That doesn't say anything about the disease. It doesn't say what's going on in the brain that's causing this problem. The issue is dementia can be caused by many different diseases. Alzheimer's disease is the most common disease that causes dementia. So Alzheimer's disease specifically is the disease that's associated with those findings that Alzheimer described, those plaques and those tangles. He described it, as I mentioned, about 100 years, more than 100 years ago. We don't make the diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease unless we're sure that the plaques and the tangles are there. So historically, we couldn't say that somebody had Alzheimer's disease until we could get the brain the way Alzheimer did and look at it in the microscope. But things have changed quite a bit, and now we are able to detect the presence of the plaques and the tangles during life and make the disease during life. So again, dementia is an umbrella term that can mean many things. It doesn't mean anything, it means having cognitive problems that impair activities of daily living, but it can be due to many things. And here are some of them: Alzheimer's disease, vascular dementia, frontotemporal dementia. There are many. There are three in particular that are very common as we get older. Alzheimer's disease, vascular dementia, that's dementia that's caused by strokes, by the vascular system that brings blood to the brain not working well. And Lewy Body dementia, another disorder that looks a lot like Parkinson's disease, and one that was recently in the news after Robin Williams passed away. Robin Williams suffered from Lewy Body dementia. So those three will come up a few more times as we move forward. As I mentioned, dementia is very prevalent. It's about 5% of the population, 3% of the population or so, at around just above the age of 60, and then it doubles every 5 years. So exponential growth. At 85 or 90, 1 in 3 to 1 in 2 people will have dementia to various degrees. And as I mentioned, dementia itself, and Alzheimer's disease as the most common cause of dementia, is the most common cause of memory loss. Here's just a quick graph showing how quickly, how dramatic the increase in the prevalence of dementia is as we get older. And as you can see, at age 85, over 35% of people suffer from some form of dementia. Women suffer from dementia more than men. This is a graph simply showing how, with age, how men and women differ in their incidence of Alzheimer's disease. But there's some data that show that women suffer from Alzheimer's disease and dementia twice as much, sometimes 3 times as much as men do. A lot of questions about that. Why? My wife is actually very interested in that particular question, and I'm running a study. I think she's angry at me that I'm a man sometimes, but anyway, there's a flyer out there for the study that she's running, and I'll mention it a little bit later too. Alzheimer's disease is also very costly. I just mentioned that both my parents suffered from memory loss, and I think any one of you who has been a caretaker or caregiver for somebody who suffers from memory loss, it's a very difficult and costly, both in terms of money, but also in terms of time and emotions. But it is, in terms of money, it's the most expensive disease that we're dealing with. And the Alzheimer's disease, the Alzheimer's Association takes time to tell us this very well. I'm not going to go over these details because I'll get bogged down in them, but it costs billions and billions a year. Let's skip over that for the sake of time. I mentioned that dementia can be due to many types of diseases, Alzheimer's disease being the most frequent, so you can appreciate that here. Bigger slice of the pie of dementia is caused by Alzheimer's disease. Here's vascular dementia, dementia with Lewy Body disease, dementia due to Lewy Body disease, and then a smattering of others. The reason why I have this graph here is that as we get older, and this is called the geriatric principle, as we get older we accumulate problems. So it's not unusual for somebody to have Alzheimer's disease, but also a little bit of vascular dementia, or maybe a little bit of Lewy Body disease. In these situations when there's more than one process taking place, we call this mixed disease. Here's an example of what that might look like. Mixed disease affects different populations differently. Men are probably a little bit different than women, although I haven't seen this kind of graph for comparing men and women. But here you can see Caucasians and African Americans, Alzheimer's, that suffer from dementia. Alzheimer's disease in Caucasians is a bigger slice of the pie. Vascular dementia, so that's in green here, vascular dementia, infarcts, much smaller in Caucasians than in African Americans. And perhaps what's most striking is that in African Americans, all three, Alzheimer's disease, Lewy Body disease, and infarcts are present more often than in Caucasians. So I thought I'd shift and talk a little bit about risk factors for Alzheimer's disease. As I mentioned, you all know it, age. Age is the very first and most important risk factor. And of course, we can't fix that one. So we'll just keep hoping for the fountain of youth. I mentioned genetics. So ApoE has different variants, and one variant, the epsilon 4 variant, increases the risk of Alzheimer's disease dramatically. If you have 2 copies of the ApoE4 allele, you're at 15 times greater risk of having Alzheimer's disease. Being a woman increases the risk. Having a family history. As I mentioned, you can have different genes, many different genes that increase the risk. And so if those genes run in your family, then there's a good chance that you got them too. So a family history of Alzheimer's disease increases the risk. Head trauma, having damage to your brain from a traumatic brain injury, increases the risk. Stroke and heart disease increases the risk. Diabetes, hypertension, hypercholesterolemia. Have you heard these terms before? These are all things that your doctor is after you about treating, about detecting and treating. We call these vascular risk factors, but they're also dementia risk factors. So really important to keep in mind. Small head size, can't do much about that. Obstructive sleep apnea, poor sleep in general, is associated with early dementia. Hearing and vision loss. Hearing in particular is a strong risk factor for Alzheimer's disease and dementia. And as I didn't mention it, but low education. So the higher degree of education you have, the less likely you are to develop Alzheimer's. We like to think of it as the higher education you have, the more connections you've made. The more connections you've made, the more damage the brain has to undergo before it becomes symptomatic. So it's not that you don't have the disease, it's that you're fighting it off better if you prepare your brain more. So you think with these risk factors, well, let's address those. Let's do something about these risk factors. Education, reducing stress, exercising, diet. In particular, we talk about the Mediterranean diet as being very important, and controlling those vascular risk factors. I like to think of it this way: there are things that increase the risk, things that decrease the risk, and you want to know how to play your cards. So you try to increase those things that make it less likely and reduce those things that make it more likely. Livingston, a researcher in the UK, puts out this paper every 2 years or so that looks at risk factors in dementia. And this changes with time as we analyze a lot of epidemiological data. But they've estimated that about 45% of the cause of Alzheimer's disease is modifiable. So these are things that you can do something about. Some of the things confer risk late in life. So things like social isolation, pollution, visual loss are things that are occurring in people in their 70s and 80s that can increase the risk, and these are things that can be fixed. We're lucky in Del Mar. There's very little social isolation here. There's very little air pollution. Beautiful place to live. As we go back though in time and we start thinking about midlife, so that's in your 50s and your 60s, maybe your 40s, excessive alcohol use, obesity, hypertension, here are the vascular risk factors coming up. And then a few more: smoking, diabetes, physical inactivity, traumatic brain injury, depression, elevated cholesterol, and hearing loss. You can see hearing loss accounts for about 7% of the risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. So when your wife tells you, you're not listening to me, or you can't hear me, or go get your hearing tested, go get your hearing tested. And finally, in early life, it's a bit late for all of us, unfortunately, but getting a better education. So staying in school longer and maybe working in jobs that encourage, if you can, working jobs that encourage continued learning. I'm still in school. And so you can imagine, this makes sense. If we can apply our knowledge of these risk factors and try to reduce those things that increase risk and increase those things that reduce risk, then we should be able to prevent dementia. And you know what? It works. This is a little bit of a complicated slide, but in principle it's fairly simple to understand. But these are large studies that looked at, you might know some of them, the Rotterdam study, the Framingham study. These are studies of large groups of people that started in their 60s. The largest one is from Boston. They just follow people in time and do testing every 5 years, testings of various kinds. Initially they were interested in heart health, but at some point they added testing of memory as well. And with that kind of hindsight, having followed people for 3 decades, you can ask the question, well, what's the incidence of dementia now compared to how it was 20 years ago? And the answer to that is it's less. So we're doing something right now. Healthcare is doing something. We're doing something as a community that is reducing the risk, or reducing the prevalence of Alzheimer's disease. So all of these dots that are on this side are proof, if you will, that there's something going on in society that's reducing the incidence of dementia. These two outliers here, these are men in Bordeaux. I won't say anything else. So, now you're thinking, how do I do this? How do I get my blood pressure down? How do I exercise? How do I engage with the community? How do I get my cholesterol down? How do I eat better? You know? And I think we all want to do that. I think we all want to live the better life. But sometimes it's hard. And so there's barriers that sort of prevent us from being able to do this on a regular basis, or to do it well. But it just sort of bring it down into these sort of 6 pillars. You know, to be social, to eat right, to get a good night's sleep, to exercise every day, to manage stress, and to engage the brain. That's the continuous nutrition piece. I will make another plug for something else that my wife is involved in, which is Halt80. This is a program that's being developed in CSD, which tries to look at, can we engage people to do the right things? Can we help them to do the right things? So that means measuring how you're doing now and finding ways to encourage you to do it better. It's a website you can go to and subscribe or register, and there's sort of coaches, electronic coaches that help you see where you are and what you can do to be in a better place for each of these things, for diet, for loneliness, for sleep, and so on. There's a pamphlet up there about that website. Eating, diet. We say, well, Mediterranean diet, and sort of leave it at that. We say you should be getting your nutrients from your food, not from supplements. But sometimes it's hard. I think if you stick to simple concepts of what Mediterranean diet is, and it turns out the American food diet isn't bad. Certainly recommend going to that. But diet by itself is not the only factor. It turns out that what you eat is important, but also how and when you eat is important. How many of you have heard about time-restricted eating? It's a new idea, and I think we've developed, as humans, we've evolved in a certain way where we were hunter-gatherers and we ate at certain times and we didn't eat at other times. And our bodies are set up to function that way. Modern living has changed that, and we find ourselves eating at various hours, or eating a little bit now and a little bit more later, and that probably produces significant changes in metabolism that increase the risk. It actually increases cardiovascular risk, and as you know, cardiovascular risk increases brain health risk. So there's a lot of ideas running around about, can we change the way we eat, in particular when we eat. And this is another study that's being done at our center called TREAD, time-restricted eating for Alzheimer's disease. This is in MCI and early Alzheimer's disease, where we restrict when you eat, try to reduce how many hours during the day when you're allowed to eat, and to see if that can actually reduce the incidence of dementia. I mentioned that women are more at risk of suffering from memory loss. We don't entirely understand why, but one clear element in the equation is inflammation. This is another study called Women's Inflammation and Tau study, which aims to look at how tau changes, how inflammation changes in women. Something else that is a flyer outside if you're interested. Okay. I was going to talk about this. I've already talked a little bit about the genetics of Alzheimer's disease. I mentioned that there are three. I didn't mention there are three, but I mentioned that there are a few genetic mutations that cause Alzheimer's disease. If you have a mutation, you get the disease, and typically the disease occurs very young. And it runs in families very, very clearly. People know exactly who has the disease and when. And you can see here, this is a pedigree of 3 generations of a family. Here's the founder here with the disease. And as you can see, out of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 children, 3 had the disease. And whenever somebody doesn't have the disease, none of the children after that will get it. If somebody does have the disease, about half the children will. So this is autosomally dominant, inheritable Alzheimer's disease. Incredibly rare, 2%. So this is, none of us have that. And if somebody in our family had it, we would know it. On the other hand, there are risk genes. And I mentioned the most significant one is ApoE, the epsilon 4 allele of ApoE. We all have ApoEs. About 20% of the population has at least one copy of the ApoE4 allele, which increases the risk. You know, we have 2 copies of every allele, or every gene. We have 2 genes, 2 copies of every gene, and we can have different alleles for each of those copies. And as I mentioned, one copy of the ApoE gene, epsilon 4 allele of the ApoE gene, increases the risk of Alzheimer's disease by 50%, increases it to 50%. So 50% chance of getting the disease in your lifetime if you have the epsilon 4. If you have 2 copies, it increases the risk to 80 to 90%. How many of you have done 23andMe or so some of you might know what your ApoE status is. You can talk to me about it later if you want. I mentioned that having E4 increases the risk by about 15 times compared to the average risk in the population. This is what happens to a brain in somebody who suffers from Alzheimer's disease. This is a normal brain, somebody who passed away from another cause that's not related to the brain itself. And this is the brain of somebody who passed away with Alzheimer's disease. And as you can see, there's a lot of shrinkage, there's a lot of loss of the brain tissue. Mostly the cortex, the area of the gray matter around the brain. You guys can hear me okay now? So the weight of the brain is about a third of the weight is gone after 1.5 kilograms to about 1,200 kilograms. 1.5 kilograms to about 1.2 kilograms. How does this happen? Well, most diseases, we understand now, are caused by the accumulation of abnormal, something goes wrong that leads to the accumulation of abnormal proteins. And you know what the bad proteins that accumulate in Alzheimer's disease, they're in the plaques and tangles. We know now that those are made of amyloid and tau. All of the other diseases, all of the other neurodegenerative diseases are associated with accumulations of something or other. This is just a picture trying to remind me of that. But in Lewy Body disease, you have accumulation of Lewy bodies. In frontotemporal dementia, you have accumulation of what we call PIC bodies, and so on. We're talking for about 26 minutes, and I've been wondering whether we should go into this, but I wanted to talk about the mechanism so we can better understand the new treatments that are available for Alzheimer's disease. Show of hands, who wants to hear about the mechanisms? Okay, careful what you wish for. So, I'll do this quickly though. Remember I said that Alzheimer's disease can be caused by a single gene, and when people have that gene, they get the disease in their 30s or 40s. So those genes, there's three, they're all involved in the processing of a molecule called APP, amyloid precursor protein. So these people who suffer from Alzheimer's disease that's genetically based, they suffer from the disease in their 30s and 40s, they are the ones that have allowed us to find out that Alzheimer's disease, at least in most people, is the consequence of poorly processing amyloid protein. These are sort of the pathways that occur in the cell that ultimately lead to the production of amyloid beta, which is a small amino acid, a small protein of about 38 to 42 amino acids long. It's a very small protein. And when this protein starts accumulating, it starts causing damage to the cell. So the accumulation of amyloid beta produces oxidation, excitotoxicity. The aggregation itself sort of causes these clumps that then interfere with the function of neurons. They induce inflammation, and they trigger abnormalities in other proteins, in particular the tau protein, which is the protein that's found in the tangles, that other abnormality that Alzheimer discovered. But it's the occurrence of all of these processes, the accumulation of A beta into the plaques, the accumulation of tau into the tangles, the oxidation, the excitotoxicity, these all lead to damage to cells. And damage to cells ultimately lead to cells' inability to speak to each other, which is critical if our brains can function. And this is what causes the symptoms, ultimately. The accumulation of amyloid and the accumulation of tau sort of marches along in the brain. It starts in one part of the brain and slowly progresses to involve other areas. A little bit like an infection. It actually jumps from one cell to the next along networks. And when that happens, it starts causing symptoms, and the symptoms are associated with whatever part of the brain happens to be damaged first. Where do you think Alzheimer's disease begins? In the memory centers. And then it progresses to involve other areas, including language centers, visual spatial centers, and the frontal lobes, which control sort of volition and organization. This is what it looks like as it progresses in the brain. It starts in the memory centers that are here, the memory centers that are here, and then works its way around in other areas. Okay. For the sake of time, I'm going to, as the disease progresses, this is time here, amyloid starts accumulating very early, and probably doesn't cause any symptoms just yet. But at some point, there's enough accumulation of amyloid and tau that people start experiencing symptoms. That's when we see that there are changes in their memory. And this is a point in time, a point in the evolution of the disease that we call MCI. As the disease progresses, other areas get involved, and the person's ability to do things day to day, to function independently, is affected. And then we don't call it mild cognitive impairment anymore, we call it dementia. So when dementia has developed in this way, as a consequence of the accumulation of abnormal amyloid and abnormal tau, we say that the dementia is due to Alzheimer's disease. This is depicting that idea in a similar way. So this is time, when we cross the bottom axis here. Preclinical stage, that's when we can't detect any changes by speaking to the people or by examining them or by testing their memory. MCI is the stage where we're having difficulties with memory, and dementia is when functionally who are having more trouble and needing help. Amyloid starts accumulating very, very early in the disease. The time between sort of half-point accumulation of amyloid to the development of symptoms. So amyloid accumulating in the brain for years and years before there are any symptoms, 10 to 15, sometimes 20 years. So when somebody develops mild cognitive impairment, has clear memory problems, the amyloid's been in the brain for a decade or two. Now, the accumulation of amyloid leads to the later accumulation of tau, and to some degree of synaptic dysfunction. So here's tau in green, and a bit of synaptic dysfunction. That's having the cells having trouble to speak to each other. And it's when that starts to peak that we start seeing problems with memory. As the disease progresses, the brain actually starts shrinking, and we don't usually see that, changes in brain structure, until well into NCI. So we've had memory problems for a little while, and by the time we start developing difficulties with our independence, dementia, the brain changes are now visible. And then finally, becoming very, very dependent occurs a little bit later on. Now, we're able to detect amyloid now. We're able to detect tau. We're able to detect those changes in synaptic function using various tests that we have. So here are the tangles. Here's the tau accumulating. Here are the memory centers. So we're able to detect the presence of amyloid with a PET scan called an amyloid PET scan. That's what that looks like. We can detect the tau and the synaptic dysfunction with two other forms of PET scan, an FDG PET scan to look at brain function, and a tau PET scan to look at the accumulation of tau. These things tend to occur at about the same time. And here's an example of an FDG PET scan and a metabolic PET scan in tau. And finally, we are able, with MRI, very, very sensitive MRI techniques, we're able to evaluate the structure of the memory centers. Here's a sort of a simple drawing of the changes that occur, the shrinkage of the brain that you saw in those pictures of real brains. And this is the memory center here, the hippocampus. And it's probably the first morphologic change that we see in the brains of Alzheimer's disease. So going from normal to very shrunken. And this is what they look like on MRI. Here's a very healthy hippocampus, and here's a hippocampus that has shrunken. So when this has happened, we know that we're well within MCI, usually a little bit further along. We can actually, with our techniques now, we can actually measure the volume of these structures and plot them on a graph that shows us where you should be relative to other people of your age and education. And this is somebody with a normal hippocampus, and here's somebody at age 70 with a hippocampus that's very shrunken and very likely to have Alzheimer's disease. Okay, I'm going to skip this. So I think it's really important. This is like, how do we decide that we want to check? How do we know that we should go see a doctor or ask, I'm having problems with my memory? This has been around for a couple of years. I think it was developed in about 20 years ago, in 2005. It's called the 88. It's 8 questions, a dementia screening interview. It's a questionnaire that's not given to the patient, it's given to somebody who cares for them, somebody who knows them well, usually a spouse, sometimes a child. These are the 8 questions. It's important that we refer to a change. So we're saying, has this particular topic, has it changed in the last few years? So problems with judgment, problems making decisions, bad financial decisions, or problems with thinking. Less interest in hobbies or activities, so pulling back, not being as active, not being as involved as they previously were. Repeats the same things over and over. Questions, stories, makes the same statements. Trouble learning how to use a tool, an appliance, or a gadget. Cell phones don't count, computers don't count. But anyways, things that you've been able to use, you can't use anymore, or things that you should be able to learn how to use, you're having trouble learning, then it's expected. People are surprised. Let me show you, I'll show you. My son's not doing that to me yet, but I'm just waiting for it. Forgets the correct month. So not knowing the day is a little bit tricky, but not knowing the month is a little bit more significant. Or the year. Trouble handling complicated financial affairs. Balancing your checkbook, working out your income taxes. I don't mean necessarily doing your income taxes, but being able to, I need these documents, I need that document. Trouble remembering appointments. We all use calendars, and I can't live without mine, but that can break down despite these helpful tools. And finally, daily we're seeing the same issues coming up over and over again. If you answer yes to 2 or more of these questions, there's a higher likelihood that there's a problem with memory. Family doctors are doing these on a regular basis now during their annual wellness visits. And we welcome that. It's really important though that it be done with the caregiver. Imagine somebody who's depressed and who feels like they're having problems managing things. They'll answer yes to many of these questions, and so when it's not given to the caregiver, it's not as a sensitive tool. But when it is, 84% sensitive, meaning that if there's a problem, there's an 85% chance that we're going to detect it and we should move forward and do something more. What do we do? I won't test you, but this is the MOCA. This is one of the tests that we do in our clinic. There's another one called the SLOMS, and probably the one that's been used for the longest time, the full steam or mean mental status examination. They're all scored out of 30. And typically you should be scoring 25 or more on all of these tests. The mini mental has been around for long enough for us to have a good sense of what the number actually means. So as I mentioned, 25 and above is sort of normal, but as the number falls on this test, we see that that's associated with difficulties day to day. So these are the activities of daily living that fail in people who suffer from dementia. So what can we do? Up until recently, we couldn't do much. We understand, we've understood for a long, long time that neurotransmitters are that neurotransmission, the communication between cells in the brain, is failing in Alzheimer's disease. And we know that those cells that are most affected are cells that secrete a neurotransmitter called acetylcholine. So acetylcholine is one of the most common neurotransmitters in the brain, and it's the one that's most effective in Alzheimer's disease. So the very first efforts treating Alzheimer's disease involve finding ways to increase the levels of acetylcholine. That's really simple. We developed small molecules that stop the breakdown of acetylcholine. You've probably heard of these medications. The most common one is called Aricept or donepezil. There's 2 others, galantamine and rivastigmine. These medications increase or reduce the breakdown of this neurotransmitter and allow the cells to have more of it around. They actually help people. They make people better.
Could you spell those 3?
I'll write them down. Yeah. They're very common. Your doctors all know about it. And then when they came out about 25, 30 years ago, they were all over the news. And they work. They work.
Thank you.
If you want, they're written here. And I can supply my slides as well to anybody who wants them. But these are the cholinesterase inhibitors. Aricept, donepezil, rivastigmine, and galantamine. There are other medications that work. This one works on excitotoxicity or hyperexcitability of cells. Acetylcholine is not the only neurotransmitter that's down in Alzheimer's disease. There are many others that are down as well. And one of the ones that I think is more relevant is serotonin. Serotonin is the neurotransmitter that's involved in depression and anxiety. So you think, well, I must be depressed or I must be anxious because I'm having memory problems, but you could be depressed and anxious because you have low serotonin because Alzheimer's disease is creeping. It was very common for us to actually also use agents that can increase the amount of serotonin in the brain. Those are called serotonin reuptake inhibitors. The most common, Prozac, Zoloft, and Co. These medications are not a treatment, but they're really effective at helping reduce the anxiety and the mood changes that occur in Alzheimer's disease, both as a consequence of the disease, a reaction to the disease, but also because of the chemistry of the disease. These medications work. Patients come back to us, families come back to us and say, you know what, we're better. But it doesn't stop the disease from progressing. Right? The amyloid is still accumulating, the tau is still accumulating, the cells are still dying. There's less and less of those neurotransmitters around, so these medications are going to do less and less as the disease progresses. We often see this kind of profile. This is actually a combination study where people were on donepezil and they were given additional memantine. So these are people on donepezil alone, and you can see they're progressing. And these are people who were given memantine, and their cognition improved as they got the memantine. And at some point, it started dropping again. Typically, this boost that you get remains, but the decline continues at about the same rate as if you've never taken the medication. You're just better off, except you turn the clock back a little bit. And typically, we turn the clock back about 6 to 9 months with these medications. So, new therapies. I talked about so right now this is the only therapy we've had up until about 2 years ago. We could only address the disease here at this level. Now, we can actually address the disease by getting rid of the amyloid. And we're working on tau. So the idea again is, it's not about helping the brain function despite the disease. It's change the process, stop it and extract if we can. A process that we would call disease modifying. We interrupt the amyloid cascade. We can target the tau pathology that I talked about. Perhaps we could even bolster neuronal survival. We could make the neurons be healthier and resist the disease better. And perhaps we could also reduce inflammation, which occurs because of the amyloid. We can. Since the amyloid hypothesis has been developed, which is about in the 1980s, 1970s, we discovered that those plaques that Alzheimer had described, we discovered that they were actually amyloid. And then we found these patients who suffered from familial Alzheimer's disease and realized that they suffer from the disease because they're not processing A-beta properly. We developed the amyloid hypothesis, and we developed those curves that I just showed you, showing how amyloid accumulates and then tau accumulates and then other changes occur. Can we get rid of the amyloid? Can we stop the amyloid from accumulating? If it's accumulated, can we get it out? It's been about 2 decades that we've been trying to do that, and up until very recently, we've failed. But with new medications, and there's 3 on the block that can do this, we are able to clear the amyloid. We can remove it from the brain. So this is the very first picture showing that this is the amyloid scan. You can see all of the amyloid accumulating in the cortex of this patient. And this is the patient after receiving aducanumab. That's Aduhelm medication. It was so controversial about 3 years ago. So we're able to take out the amyloid. There are currently 2 medications that have been accepted by the FDA as treatments for Alzheimer's disease that remove the amyloid. Lecanemab and donanemab, Leqembi and Kisunla. They've gone through rigorous testing. They've gone through what we call phase 3 double-blind placebo-controlled trials with thousands of patients. And they've demonstrated in these patients, 1, that we can take out the amyloid, and the amyloid is the more of the drug we give, the more amyloid we take out. And this is an example of a measurement of how much amyloid there is in the brain using a PET scan. And you can see somebody who is not receiving the drug continues to accumulate very slowly a little bit of the amyloid, but somebody who's on the drug, the amyloid is completely removed. This removal of the amyloid should lead to some extent, and again, there's a lot of controversy here because there's so many other things that have occurred since the amyloid started the whole process. Now, amyloid in your brain 20 years before there's any symptoms causes a lot of problems. Tau starts accumulating, causes a lot of problems. It's going to be hard to reverse all of those changes. But if we can take out the amyloid, perhaps we can reduce how the impacts moving forward on your brain, per se. So we're hoping that there's going to be less and less damage to your brain as on our hands as the disease progresses, if we can take out the amyloid that triggered the process in the first place. The answer there is we can. Now, in contrast to giving Aricept or giving memantine to somebody taking Aricept and seeing a boost in cognition, we're not actually helping the brain function better. So what can we expect from this kind of medication? We can expect a slowing of the decline. These are the first curves that actually show that we've prevented or that we've slowed the process of Alzheimer's disease. So these are patients that are receiving lecanemab. This is over, the graph that I showed you earlier is 24 weeks. The methicillin being given to patients 24 weeks. This is a year and a half. And as you can see, this is a one scale that was used in the study, ADL, so activities of daily living. So this isn't, can you remember something or can you multiply numbers? This is how well you're functioning. It's much more relevant to day to day. What we're seeing is that there's about a 20 to 30% reduction in progression of the disease over the 18 months. Yeah, it's the first time we've ever seen this. You can think of this a little bit as how much did I turn the clock back? So if you were getting the drug, you reach this level of impairment at this point here. If you were not on the drug, you reach that same level of impairment here. And the difference between this time and this time is about 8 months. So over a year and a half, can give you an extra, I can slow the process down so that you get 8 months more than the person who didn't get the medication. Again, that might not seem that significant, but in a disease that within 5 years, when it progresses rapidly, or 10 years when it progresses more slowly, that's not an insubstantial amount of time. It's an amount of time where maybe you're driving better, or you're able to balance your checkbook more, or you don't need help preparing dinner. I'm giving a very positive spin to this because I do believe that it works, but it's not for everybody. These medications are not without side effects, and they are, for the time being, they're also very expensive. It's also fairly clear that these medications work best if they're given very early. So as soon as MCI is detected, these medications are likely to work better than if the dementia is settled and the patient is already dependent on many tasks. So I've just talked about preventing and removing A-beta aggregation. What about all of these other areas? What about the tau phosphorylation? What about the inflammation? What about the excitotoxicity and the oxidation? What about the cell death? Can we do anything about those things? Because those things are probably still happening. And the answer is, and even more, why don't we go back further up the stream, and can we do anything about these enzymes that are cutting that protein into that toxic A-beta form? Can we prevent these? So these are all things that are being studied currently. In fact, there are hundreds of medications that are being studied right now. This is from a paper that comes out every year. This is the 2024 version of the papers. This is one of my mentors, Jeff Cummings, who puts out this paper yearly. It's called the Alzheimer's disease treatment pipeline. And as you can see, there's lots and lots of medications that are being evaluated in disease modifying. These are all biologics, these are all antibodies or vaccines. But we're also looking at smaller molecules that could be potentially taken by mouth that can also reduce, slow down the process of the disease. And we're continuing to study other aspects of Alzheimer's disease, including cognitive enhancers like donepezil or Aricept, and also other symptomatic treatments. As you might know, as the disease progresses, mood changes, including anxiety and depression, are important, but then there can be other changes that are even more difficult to manage, such as aggression or restlessness, and those too need to be addressed. So we do have a lot of studies that are ongoing and starting at UCSD and in centers like ours. Studies looking at anti-inflammatories, studies looking at anti-tau. There's a new vaccine that's going to be studied very soon. I'm part of a study that looks at gene therapy that allows for the secretion within cells of BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. This is a small chemical that reduces cell death and improves cellular health and allows cells to make more connections. Time-restricted eating, I talked about with our TREAD study. And of course, we're interested in following patients and normal people who don't suffer from memory loss, understanding how changes occur with time, differentiating those things that are associated with Alzheimer's disease and those things that are not. I have a few more slides. I've been talking for 52 minutes. I promised that I would only talk for 45.
Go for it.
Careful what you ask for. I was going to mention some of the studies. So the brain-derived neurotrophic factor, this is a gene therapy that involves placement of a vector, a new gene. We actually infuse the gene into the memory centers, or right next to the memory centers. And when the gene becomes active in the brain, it starts secreting BDNF, this neurotrophic factor. What we expect this to do is increase memory, improve memory, and we hope allow those memory cells that are initially affected where the disease starts to form new connections and perhaps even prevent progression. Again, very hopeful. I'm giving you the best case scenario in this particular study. The ADRC, the Alzheimer's Disease Research Center, is very, very active here in the city. We're looking for volunteers all the time. There's a pamphlet up there about the center. I know that you can't, well, you might be able to with your phone and your phone's magnifying capability to scan this QR code, but that'll get you to our website where you can register for participation in the research studies, or to just be in our registry to receive information about what we're doing. Here's the QR code again. I'll say finally, when I came to UCSD, I was part of recruitment. Many people were recruited, and I'm just one of those members. An effort being made to offer better dementia care, better memory care. This is a graph from the Alzheimer's Association, sort of trying to put in a graphic form what it's like to seek care for somebody who suffers from memory loss. And it is a maze. Our effort at UCSD is sort of try to bring together psychologists, social workers. Social workers are the most important part of our clinic, by the way. Shout out to any other social workers in the house. And neuropsychology, neurologists, geriatricians to take care of those vascular risk factors. We also work very closely with physical therapy, occupational therapy, and home health to try to bring to families that are taking care of somebody who suffers from memory loss the tools that they need. So this is a little bit about our clinic, and of course the idea is that we could change that into this. All right. Okay.